A gute Woche and a good Lag Beimer, everyone. Rebbe soll gesund sein, began the Farbrengen this afternoon. This is the Shabbos, which is Erev Lag Beimer. And today's Sedre is Parshas Emor. When we look right at the beginning of Parshas Emor, we find something which has a very strong relation to the Inyan of Lag Beimer. Parshas Emor begins, Emor el HaKoyanim, and Rashi immediately tells us that the word Emor is mentioned twice in the pasuk. Emor ve'amarta lahazhir gedolim al haktanim. That means that it is the responsibility of the gedolim, of the adults, that they have to warn the youngsters and caution the youngsters to see to it that the youngsters of the Koyanim will also be careful in the dinim which are related here in the beginning of the Seder. However, regarding Lag Baimer, we see that the Minig Yisrael, how it's customary by Yidden on Lag Baimer, it is that children do not remain in the frame of cheder, in the frame of learning, as a child usually does every day. And we know how great and important, how Chazal stressed the importance of the inyan of a child learning in cheder. And nonetheless, when it comes on Lag Baimer, children usually do not remain in cheder and leave the cheder, and as the custom by Yidden was always that children would go into the field on Lag Baimer or to similar related places. And in fact, the Frierdiker Rebbe related that not only did children do this, but even adults, regarding the Mittler Rebbe, that the Mittler Rebbe and all his Hasidim would go out into the field on Lag Baimer. And we find even regarding the Arizal, the Rebbe continues, that the Arizal would leave his home on Lag Baimer. Where would he go? He would go to Miron. And Miron is where the cave of Rab Shimon ben Yochai is. But again, the same idea, he would leave his home. So we see that the idea of Lag Baimer is one leaves his home and goes into the field or to a similar place. And this can be understood, the Rebbe continues, based on the expression Eis Lasois Lashem Heifeiru Teirasecha. If it's an Eis Lasois, meaning it's a time to do something for the sake of Hashem, then we even interfere with Torah. And the expression here is Teirasecha, your Torah. Especially as explained in Chassidus, that in Torah there are various levels. And when we say Teirasecha, it means the highest level in Torah, how it's obvious how the Torah is the Eibishter's Torah. Just like Chassidus explains regarding Chanukah, we find the expression in V'ala Nisim, we find the expression Lahashkichom Teirasecha, what was the intention of the Yevonim? What did they want to accomplish? They wanted to tear Yidden away from the fact that they are attached with the Eibishter's Torah. That when a Yid learns Torah and realizes that this is Torah Hashem, this is what they wanted to interfere with. The fact that a Yid should learn Torah, that didn't bother them. There's a lot of wisdom in Torah. Torah is intellectual. But when a Yid learns Torah and he realizes that it's Teirasecha, this is what bothered them and this is what they wanted to break. This is what they wanted to interfere with, that a Yid Chas v'Shalom should not do it any longer. The same when the expression is Chukei Ritzinecha, so Chassidus explains what was in their way. The fact that the Yid has such a strong tie to Chukim. Chayk is those mitzvahs which we do not understand. There's no reason for them. Ritzoinecha. Why are we doing it? Only because it is the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So now back here, when we find the expression Eis Lasos Lashem Heifeiru Teirasecha, meaning we're talking about the level of Torah in a very high level. It is a level of Teirasecha. And nonetheless, we still say that when it comes to an Eis Lasos, it is a time to do Lashem for the sake of Hashem. We do away with Teirasecha, and we do the inyanim which we are told to do. And with this we can understand that there's the Yerushalmi. In the Yerushalmi it is mentioned that a minig A minig Yisrael is so powerful that when there's a Jewish custom which is contradictory to a halacha, we go according to the minig, according to the custom. How can this be understood? Also, in light of what we just mentioned, when we're talking about a minig Yisrael, something which Yidden have adopted to do, or something which Yidden are doing with the fullest sincerity. In other words, it is done because it is an eis la'asos l'Hashem. It is done because it's a time to do this thing for the sake of Hashem. So then, even when this is contradictory to a halacha, so we apply what we just mentioned, eis la'asos l'Hashem, heiferu teiraseh. So this is the whole inyan of Lag B'Omer. As well, that Lag B'Omer, we go out into the field, though that it involves an inyan where the children are not learning in Cheder on that day, still it's an eis la'asos to take the children and take him out of the Beis Rabbon, take him out of the Cheder, out of the frame of school, and take him into the field. And here we go a step further. The expression in Rashi is lehazhir gedolim alaktanim. That it is the responsibility of the adults, that the adults have to warn the youngsters. However, in Hebrew, lahazhir has another meaning. Lahazhir here stems from the word zohar, shining, lichtigkeit, spiritual illumination. So the Rebbe teaches, when it lahazir gdolim alaktanim, when the gedolim do their obligation, and they caution the Ktanim and see to it that the Ktanim act properly, and they also follow the mitzvahs which they are told. This adds lichtigkeit to the Gedolim. Lehazhir Gedolim ala Ktanim. When the Gedolim caution the youngsters and relate the Torah to the youngsters so that the youngsters will know what to do, this adds a spiritual illumination, a zohar, a lichtigkeit to these Gedolim. And this is very appropriate, again, on the day of Lag B'Omer, because we're talking here, Lag B'Omer is the day of Reb Shimon ben Yochai. Reb Shimon ben Yochai's Sefer is the Sefer HaZohar, which is also an Inyan Zohar of Lichtigkeit. In fact, in the beginning of the Zohar, right away, in the opening lines of the Sefer, he discusses the pasuk, V'hamaskilim yazhiru ki Zohar harakia. Meaning those that understand, those that are considered maskilim, yazhiru, they will, by them it will be such a lichtigkeit, such a shine, kizoya harakia, as the shine of the sky. Here the Rebbe mentioned that there are rishonim that refer to the Zohar in their writings, and these rishonim were written before the Zohar was printed. In other words, before the Zohar even had the title of Zohar. And at the same time, how do they refer to the Sefer of Reb Shimon ben Yochai? Yoir, the Sefer HaYoir, also the same idea, the idea of Lichtigkeit. The only thing is, Yoir is in Hebrew and Zohar is in Aramaic. What is the difference? In Hebrew, the Pshat and Lashon HaKodesh. Aramaic is a step further. Aramaic is the way the Inyanim already are coming into the world. So the accomplishment of Reb Shimon ben Yochai is that not only in the level of Lashon HaKodesh does he instill Lichtigkeit, does he bring spiritual illumination, but even in a further level, even in the level of Aramaic, in other words, where Kedusha is not as obvious, even in that Madregi, he's also instilling the inyan of Zohar, the inyan of Lichtigkeit. So here we have a very obvious shaykhus between the inyan of Parshas Emor and Lag B'Omer. And Lag B'Omer comes right after Parshas Emor, and right away, immediately, Motzei Shabbos, we already have Lag B'Omer. Here the Rebbe brought that the Alter Rebbe in the Shulchan Aruch tells us that on Motzei Shabbos we should eat a special meal of Malav and Malka. And what does he explain? He explains that we are Melava the Malka. In other words, we are bidding farewell to the queen. Who is the Malka? That is the Shabbos. Comes Motzei Shabbos, we are bidding farewell to the queen. It's like we are parting with the queen. So what do we see from these words at Alter Rebbe? When we part with someone, it means that the person who we are parting with is still here. And we're making a special celebration, a special Suda to part with him. In other words, in Motzei Shabbos, the Shabbos is still with us. And we are now parting with the Shabbos. So when it comes Motzei Shabbos tonight, it is Lag Baimer, and it is Lag Baimer, and at the same time, here the Lag Baimer and Parshas Emor and the Shabbos are being united. Tomorrow is going to be Lag Baimer, and Lag Baimer is the first day in Parshas Bahar. That is the next Seder. What do we read about in Parshas Bahar? Parshas Bahar, the Torah tells us, the beginning of Bahar, the Torah tells us the halachas, the dinim that apply to Shemitah, which means that once in 7 years there was a sabbatical year for the field, and no field work was permitted to be done in Eretz Yisrael. And this would come once in 7 years. If we look into the Torah, into the beginning of Parshas Bahar, the pasuk starts as follows: Daber el bnei Yisrael, talk to the Yid, v'amart aleim, thou shalt tell them, Ki savoyu la'aretz, when you will come into the land, Asher ani noisan lachem, which I am giving you. The Rabbeinu Shalom says, V'shof sahar Shabbos l'Hashem. The land should have a Shabbos. Then the pasuk goes on, Shei shanim tizra sadecha. For 6 years you should do the work in your field and the work in your vineyards. V'asaftas tvos, and you will gather everything that will grow. It'll come to the 7th year. On the 7th year you will take a rest. How does the pasuk begin? The end of the second pasuk is very strange, the Rebbe is asking. Pasuk says, when you will enter Eretz Yisrael, that is when V'shof sa'aret Shabbos l'Hashem, you will have a year of rest. That's not the way it works. The way it works is as the pasuk continues. You have to enter Eretz Yisrael, and it wasn't immediately upon entering Eretz Yisrael either. It took 7 years for them to have the battle with the Knaanim whose land they took over. It took 7 years to divide Eretz Yisrael. After that, after working for 6 years, that is when Shemitah came. From the pasuk, it seems different. Pasuk says, Ki savayu al haaretz asher ani noisen lachem, when you will come into the land which I am giving you, v'shof sa'aret Shabbos l'Hashem, that is when the earth will take a rest. When did the earth take a rest? The earth rested many years later. That wasn't initially upon entering Eretz Yisrael that there was a rest, a sabbatical year to the earth. This first came after it was the 6 years of doing work. And the 6 years came after 14 years that it took the Yidden to settle in Eretz Yisrael. After all that, that is when they had a year of Shabbos. But the pasuk starts off different. The pasuk starts off immediately when you will come, V'shof sa'aret Shabbos l'Hashem. So the Rebbe is learning. What is the meaning of the pasuk? The meaning of the pasuk is as follows. When you enter Eretz Yisrael, you have to realize that what is the goal behind all the work that you will do in Eretz Yisrael and all the hard labor and hard toil of plowing and working in your fields and working for your wheat and for your vineyards and for the trees. The goal of all of this is that it should come to a year of V'shof sa'aret Shabbos l'Hashem. In other words, the pasuk is immediately telling us what is the ultimate goal of our work in Eretz Yisrael. To come to a level of Shabbos l'Hashem. And here we find something similar in Gemara. There's a Gemara, the Gemara tells us that the opinion of Beis Shammai is that immediately from the beginning of the week, if a Yid comes across something which is nice, which is suitable for Shabbos, he should say, this is nice for Shabbos, I will save it. What could happen is, if he finds something nicer later in the week, then he can take the thing which he found early in the week and use it. However, what do Beis Shammai tell us? That immediately from Motzei Shabbos on, a Yid is busy preparing for the next Shabbos. The same we have here when we're talking in a Shabbos of years. When we're talking in a Shabbos of years, the pasuk is telling us that what is the ultimate goal of all our hard work, so that finally we will come to a madrege of Vishafsa ha'aretz Shabbos Lashem, meaning that we will instill Kedusha into the earth, into the land of Eretz Yisrael, with the land which we are entering, that will also come to a level of Shabbos. As explained, all the great inyanim, what Shabbos stands for. And with this we can also understand, the Rebbe continues, there's a Gemara. Gemara tells us that a Talmud Chacham is called with the title of Shabbos. Obviously, what's the relation between a Talmud Chacham and Shabbos? Every person has his name, has his personal name, how he's identified. So here we say that besides him having his personal name, Chazal tell us something additional, that every Yid every Talmud Chacham rather, can be identified as Shabbos. With what we are discussing now, we can understand it. What is the inyan of Shabbos? The inyan of Shabbos is that it is nothing in itself. The whole idea of Shabbos expresses a dedication to the Rebbeinu. In other words, as the Chassidish expression would be, no mitzias, no being in itself. Its whole existence is only because of the Rebbeinu. This is the same idea with a Talmud Chacham. What is a Talmud Chacham? In other words, he has no interest in anything else. His only interest is in Torah. Therefore, the same idea is when we're talking now here about the idea of Shabbos in years. Shabbos in years, which Taka came in the sequence, in the cycle of the calendar year. Taka came many years later. However, immediately upon your entering Eretz Yisrael, you have to know that what is the ultimate goal of all this? That the V'shafsa ha'aretz Shabbos Lashem. The Rebbe says this can also be an interpretation for what he's been talking about at many occasions, explaining the importance that a little child has to take his room and his bed and his closet and all the things that belong to the child and make it, as the expression would be, for a Beis Chabad or for a Beis Sivos Hashem. What is all this about? It's all the same idea. Obviously, these are things which a child is coming into contact with. He needs the bed so that he can sleep in his bed. He needs his closet so that he can keep all the things in his closet or write on his desk, or all the things the child has. What are we demanding from a child? We're demanding from a child that the child should realize that what is the ultimate goal behind all these things? Why is he doing all these things? He's doing all these things like the inyan of Shabbos. What is the inyan of Shabbos? Shabbos is... What is the inyan of Shabbos in the week and as well as in years? In Shabbos we see how a Yid becomes totally associated with the Eibishter. The same idea is the inyan of a Beis Chabad or a Beis Sivos Hashem, that it should be felt by the child, that what is all these things that he is doing in his room or in his surroundings, in his environment, it's all to bring godliness into his environment. It's the same idea of Shabbos. It'll be continued. What type of impact could it have, especially now that we're in the days that we're coming close to the coming of Mashiach? So the pasuk tells us, "V'heishiv leiv avos al banim, v'leiv banim al avosam," that not only do older have utilize their hashpah, their influence on the younger, but also the young utilize their influence on their parents. In other words, v'heishiv leiv avos al yidei banim. It is the banim that have a hashpah, that have an effect on the avos, on their parents, and bring their parents closer to Yiddishkeit and to the Rebbeinu. And the Rebbe says, when parents see that when their children express with the fullest sincerity how their room and all their things that they have, they refer to it as a Beis Chabad or as a Beis Sivos Hashem, and you see the real sincerity that a child has when a child expresses all this, because this is the nature of children, that when a child does something, he does it with all he has. He doesn't ask questions. He does it because he was told to do so. He does it with the greatest sincerity. So when parents see their children acting in such a way, this in itself has an effect on the parents as well, that this uplifts the parents also. As it's customary in Farbrengen the Rebbe discusses a Rashi in the week Sedra, as well as an Inyan in the Rambam, and during the summer weeks also a Mishnah in the Pirkei Avos, which we recite on this particular Shabbos. Today, in the Farbrengen, the Rebbe discussed two Rashis in Parshas Emor. One, the first Rashi in the beginning of the Sedra, and another one later, further in the Sedra, which we will get to shortly. The beginning of the Sedra, Rashi quotes Emor ala Kohanim. The Rebbe is telling Moshe, speak to the Kohen. So Rashi right away tells us, Emor v'amarto. There's a double expression in the pasuk. The pasuk says, Emor ala Kohanim b'nei Aaron. Speak to the Kohanim, the children of Aaron. Then the pasuk goes on, v'amarta aleim, and thou shalt tell them. Why is the fact of telling them, saying them, mentioned twice in the pasuk? So Emor ve'amarta. So Rashi explains, lahazhir g'doyla malaktan. This means, comes a special instruction over here, that it is the obligation of the g'doylim, of the elders, that they have to make sure that the ktanim, the little ones, will also be familiar with all of these halachas. So the Rebbe asks a question, first of all, why does Rashi have to quote the words Emor ala Kohanim? Say to the Kohanim. Rashi is troubled by the fact why the word Emor is repeated twice here in the pasuk. So Rashi should have only quoted the word Emor and say Emor v'amarta lahazir g'doyla malaktan. But Rashi quotes more than that. Rashi quotes the word ala Kohanim as well. There are those that want to learn that by Rashi quoting the words Emor ala Kohanim, this is an indication that we are entering a new Sedra. In other words, in Rashi's commentary, Rashi wanted to show us that we have finished Parshas Kedoshim, or we're entering already the Sedra of Emor ala Kohanim. Rabbi says this interpretation is not acceptable. Why? Because first of all, that's not the name of the Sedra. The name of the Sedra is not Emor ala Kohanim. The name of the Sedra is Emor. One word. Besides, this is not Rashi's inyan. If we will look through the various Sedras, we will see that Rashi is not careful that his first Pirush in the beginning of the Sedra should always be based on the title of the Sedra. This is not what Rashi gets involved with. When we follow closely and we see the words that he quotes, we will notice which is the previous Sedra and which is the new Sedra. But Rashi's inyan is not to tell us what is the name of the Sedra which we are entering now. So the question is back, why does Rashi have to quote the words Emor ala Kohanim? Ala Kohanim. So the Rebbe is learning Pshat in this Rashi, that the child who is learning Chumash is well aware what a Kohen is. A Kohen, there's a pasuk, you shall come to the Kohen that's going to be in your days. A Kohen is an individual who is higher than everyone else. And what is his inyan? His inyan is to teach Klal Yisrael, to relate to Klal Yisrael. He relates to Klal Yisrael, and his inyan is to uplift Klal Yisrael. This is what the Kohanim and the Levim were all about. And if we're talking in Kohanim and Levim, specifically Kohen. So in other words, the child knows. I'm using another definition. For Kohen would be a Godel. So the pasuk here tells us Emor ala Kohanim, that the Kohanim are being instructed, v'amarta aleim, and they also have to again instruct the youngsters. Make sure that everybody knows all these dinim which are discussed here. So being that the pasuk stresses Emor ala Kohanim, this is an indication to Rashi lahazhir g'doylem alaktan, because the Kohanim are the g'doylem, and therefore the g'doylem are the ones that have to relate to the ktanim. Because the question arises, we learn in today's Pirkei Avos, mikol malamda hiskalti. A person says that he learns from everybody. Anyone who's offering me to learn from, I learn from. So why does Rashi stress lahazhir g'doylem alaktanim, that it is the g'doylem, those who are considered the big ones, spiritually big ones? They are the ones that are relating to the ktanim. Why can't the beinanim relate to the ktanim? Why can't the middle ones relate to the ktanim? After all, we know that we have to learn
and accept from everyone. Mikol melamdai hiskalti. I've gained knowledge from all my teachers. If I'm gaining knowledge from all my teachers, why dafka does it have to be a godel? So the Rebbe says, at the same time, however, we see that when a godel takes from his time and dedicates himself to relate to a cotton, it has a much stronger impact on the cotton than if he would hear it from a simple person or from an ordinary person or from a Beinani. When he hears from a Godel, it has a much stronger effect. So now that the Pasuk is telling us, Emor ala koyanim, and koyanim are considered Gedolim, so Rashi is learning. And we also have the extra of Amarta, Emor of Amarta. Therefore, we derive from this lahazir gedolim alaktanim, that it comes to tell us that the gedolim are responsible, that they have to make sure that the ktanim become familiar in all of the inyanim and all these details of Tumah which are discussed here pertaining to the Kohen. This is regarding this Rashi. Then we have another Rashi, which Rashi explains the inyan of Kiddush Hashem. It is in Kapitel Chav Beis, Pasuk Lamed Beis, before Revi. Pasuk says, "V'lo yisechalalu Hashem kochi." You should not weaken my name. V'nikdashti, and I shall be sanctified b'soich b'nei Yisrael amongst the Yidden. Ani Hashem mikadishchem. I am the Rebishter who is making you holy, is making you, bringing kedusha into you. V'lo yisechalalu. It's a long Rashi, but let's try and go through it. V'lo yisechalalu. You should not cause like a chilul Hashem. Desecrate the name of Hashem. So Rashi explains, Lavoir al divrei mezidin. You shouldn't do anything intentionally against the will of the Rebishter. And then the pasuk goes on. Mimash mashenema v'lo yisechalalu. Once it already says in the pasuk v'lo yisechalalu, ma talmud loima v'nikdashti. Why is there a need again to stress v'nikdashti, that you shall sanctify me? Misoyer atzmecha v'kadesh mi. Sacrifice your life to sanctify my name. Yochel bi yochid. I would want to think that this is only singular, privately. Talmud loima b'soich b'nei Yisrael. It should be done publicly amongst b'nei Yisrael. And Rashi goes on. Ukshu moiser atzmoi, and when he's ready to sacrifice his life, yimser atzmoi al menas lomus. He should be ready to do it even if he knows that it will cost his life. Shekola moiser atzmoi al menas haneis. If somebody is sacrificing himself, but what he really intends to see a miracle, then he will not have the miracle. This is what we find by Hananiah, Mishael, v'Azariah. They did not sacrifice themselves with the intention that a miracle should happen, and that is why a miracle happened. This is what kind of a long interpretation do we have here in Rashi? And Rashi is getting involved actually in the halachas of Kiddush Hashem, and the halachas of our obligation to sanctify Hashem's name. Why does Rashi get involved in all this? Rebbe is explaining, furthermore, raising a very strong question. What is Rashi really talking about? That when a goy, a non-Jew, is going after a Jew, for example, and he wants him to worship Avodah Zarah, or he's going after him for something which is requiring from the Yid that the Yid should be willing to sacrifice his life. And this is considered sanctifying the name of the Rebishter, v'nikdashti b'soich b'nei Yisrael, and not desecrating his name. Rabbi is asking a very simple question. What are we saying? That when a Yid is sacrificing his life and giving up his life, how does this bring Kedusha? How does this bring more sanctifying of the Rebishter's name? Rabbi says when we look through Jewish history, especially when this was written, when Rashi wrote his Pirush, his commentary. And this was written in days when Yidden had many, many problems. And the child for whom Rashi wrote his Pirush is well familiar how many gzeres, trials and tribulations the Yidden in his generation went through. What kind of a kedusha, what kind of a sanctification for the Rebishter's name is it the fact that a person gives his life for the sake of Hashem, that a goy comes and shows that his power is stronger than the power of a Yid, and therefore what happens is, as a result of that, the life of the Yid is taken away. How does this show v'nikdashti b'seich b'nei Yisrael? So the Rebbe is learning. What Rashi is here to tell us is Rashi is telling us is that when a person, a Yid, is forced into a situation which may cost his life, he should not look for a miracle to happen. This is what Rashi is stressing. As we see, way back in Chumash, we find by Haran and Avraham, way back, Avraham went into the Kivshon Ha'esh, went into the burning, was put into the burning oven by Nimrod, and so was Haran. So what are we told? That the life of Avraham was saved, and the life of Haran was not saved. Why? So Chazal explained. Avraham went, he wasn't looking for any miracles. This is what it meant, that he has to give up his life to sanctify the name of the Rebishter. He was ready to do it. Haran was already looking for miracles, and he was standing by the side and was watching what's going to happen to Avraham, and was figuring if Avraham is saved, then the same miracle that's happening to Avraham will probably happen to him as well. And what happened at the end result? The Taka did not happen. But back to the Rashi here. What is the Rebbe learning? What is the v'nikdashti? What brings kedusha b'soich b'nei Yisrael? Ani Hashem mekaddishchem. Not the fact that when a Yid is forced into a situation by a goy, and the Yid is forced to give up his life. Yitaki gives his life for the Eibishter, but this is not something which brings kedusha v'nikdashti b'seich b'nei Yisrael. What is the v'nikdashti? The v'nikdashti is that when a Yid is in such a situation, and the Eibishter brings a nace, and the Eibishter saves his life, this shows the kedusha, this shows the sanctity of Hashem. The only thing Rashi is telling us, that when we are forced into such a situation, we should not seek for it. We should not look for it. If we will not look for it, then the Rebishter will in turn show a miracle. And when the Rebishter will show a nes, this showing the nes of the Rebishter, this is the v'nikdashti b'seich b'nei Yisrael. In other words, the Rebbe is introducing a new Pirush in Rashi. Normally, how are we learning what is the v'nikdashti b'seich b'nei Yisrael? What is the kedusha? How a Yid, the Rebishter, sanctified amongst Yidden when a Yid gives his life for kedushas Hashem, lets his life be taken away. He's Meisa Nefesh himself. The Rebbe is learning different. The Rebbe is learning what is the v'nikdashti b'seich b'nei Yisrael when a Yid is willing to give up his life. And the Yid, from his point of view, he's ready. However, the Rebishter is performing such a nes that a nes is happening and the life of the Yid is safe. And therefore, this in the end result leads to v'nikdashti b'seich b'nei Yisrael ani Hashem mekaddishchem. The Rambam, which was discussed today, the Rebbe learned a Rambam that, with the Rambam in the halachas of macholos asuras, the foods which we are forbidden to eat, and blood, we know we are prohibited to drink blood. Regarding foods which we are not allowed to eat, food has a shiyah. In other words, there's a certain amount, it's a size, a quantity. What quantity is the Torah refer to? That to say that if a person did eat or drink this quantity, to consider him that he transgressed and went against the will of the Rebbe. So by macholim, by food, it is the size of a zayis, the size of an olive. If one ate
any Michael also, anything which the Torah tells us we are not allowed to eat, and he did eat it, and he ate the size of an olive of that food, that is, then it is considered that he has transgressed the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu regarding this specific thing. Just to mention in Gemara, there's a machlokes regarding chotzi shia, meaning if he ate part of the olive. In other words, he ate a smaller piece, smaller than the olive. So in Gemara, there's a machlokes whether this is considered also asr min ha-Torah, but the only thing is that he's not being punished for it. Or another opinion in Gemara is that min ha-Torah it is no issa. It is only an issa midarabana. The Chachamim have told us, even though you are not eating the full olive, you're eating less than an olive, being that the Torah has asad, the Torah has told us that this specific food we are prohibited to eat, we shall not eat. Now the question comes up regarding blood. What is the shia that if one drinks blood, that it's considered that he has transgressed the Issa of HaKadosh Baruch Hu of l'seichel dam? So regarding blood, there's something very interesting. Normally, regarding a liquid, it is not the size of an olive, the quantity of an olive. Regarding liquid, it is a revius. Regarding blood, we find an exception. That the quantity on the prohibition of blood is not measured as if it would be a drink, a liquid, but the quantity is as if it would be a food. Not a revius, but rather a kazayis. The Rebbe is asking that this halacha requires an interpretation, we have to look for some sort of a reasoning. Though we know that in general, all the shiurim, all the quantities as far as all different type of isurim were related through Moshe from Sinai, but at the same time we have to have some sort of an understanding why should blood be different than any other type of liquid. And when it comes to the issa, to the prohibition of drinking blood, the quantity is measured as if it would be a food. To understand this, the Rebbe brought a commentary of the Rambam in Mishnah, and this is in Erevin. There the Mishnah tells us, Bakoil ma'arvin chutz mimelach umayim. If we want to make an Erev which unites several reshusim, several properties together, so that we should be able to carry on Shabbos. So there's a din of a ruvei chatzeros. There's also a din of a ruvei tchumin, which means a person is not allowed to walk on Shabbos more than a certain amount outside of city limits. If one does want to walk more than these 2,000 amos, what does he do? He would put his food, his portion, his Shabbosdika portion, at the end of the first 2,000 amos, which means that he kind of has based a residence also at that spot, and therefore it gives him 2,000 additional amos from that spot. We're not getting into the details of Erev, but the Mishnah tells us what kind of food is acceptable to use for an Erev. Mishnah says, Bakoil ma'arvin. We can use any type of food. Chutz, there is exceptions. Melach and mayim. Water and salt. This is a Mishnah. The Rambam in his commentary on Mishnah explains why not water and salt. So he tells us as follows. He says every food, when a person eats it, if he was hungry before, it takes away his hunger. Salt and water, the Rambam says, does not take away one's hunger. And therefore it is not considered a meichel that he should be able to use it for an erev. What is the inyan of water, of drinking? Food normally calms a person's hunger. What does water accomplish? What water accomplishes is, it takes the food and carries it through the person's body. This is the accomplishment of water. In other words, so that the food that he has eaten should have the proper effect on the person, he has to drink. In fact, the Rebbe mentioned it's brought in Svarim that the quantity what a person eats is by far more than the quantity what he drinks. Because what he drinks is only needed to lead the food, to carry the food within his body, that the food should have the proper functioning on. Then we come across an expression in Gemara. Ochal v'loi shosa. Chazal tell us, if a person eats and did not drink, what do Chazal say? Ki ilu ochal dam. It is considered like he has eaten blood. In other words, his eating will not have a proper effect on him. It wouldn't have a positive accomplishment on the person. On the contrary, it is ki'ilu ochal dam. Such an extent. What do we see from this Chazal? That when we're talking about dam, when we're talking about blood, the Gemara uses the expression ki'ilu ochal dam. It is like he has eaten blood. Gemara should have said, if a person eats and does not drink, it is as if he had drunk blood. Why does the Gemara say, as if he has eaten blood? What do we see from this? That when it comes to blood, we do not evaluate blood, we do not look at it like a drink, and therefore, if a person taka drinks blood and transgresses the Issa, which prohibits us to drink blood, it should be considered with the same quantity like any other drink, but blood is an exception. The Torah has given blood a status not of a drink, but a status of a food. And therefore, if he goes ahead and transgresses against the prohibition of drinking blood, what quantity is considered a Isser of dam? We do not measure it as if it would be another drink of Isser, but we measure it as if it would be a food of Isser. And therefore it is with the Kazayas. Regarding the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, it is the fourth Perek today, and the Rebbe explained. Mishnah begins with a quotation of Ben Zoma. Ben Zoma says, Eizahu Chacham, who is wise, Haloimid Mikol Adam, who learns from every person. Then he goes ahead, Eizahu Giber, who is considered strong, Hakoivish is Yitzchak, who controls his Yetzer Hara. Eizahu Asher, who is considered rich, Hasameach Bechelko, who is happy with his share. Eizahu Mechubat, who is considered an honored person, the one who honors others. Hamechabed Sabribs. So Ben Zoma is listing four categories of people. He says, you know why Ben Zoma lists these four categories? We find a different Gemara. There's a Gemara somewhere. Gemara tells us that Ben Zoma saw 600,000 people at one time. There's a special, the Gemara tells us that there's a special bracha which one should make when he sees such an amount of people. So that's why Ben Zoma saw such an amount of people. However, to categorize what are the four most important categories of people, he was the one that was able to evaluate it. In other words, he saw the most amount of people at one time more than any other Tana. Now he's coming to put into general categories what are the four most important categories amongst people. So he's telling us the four most important categories is a wise, a chacham, a gibayr, a ashir, and a mechubat. The Rebbe says we're before Lag B'Omer, so we have to find some sort of a relation between this Perek and Lag B'Omer, and we don't have to go far. This is a quotation of Ben Zoma, and right after this we come to the second Mishnah, which is a quotation of Ben Azai. There's an interesting Gemara that Ben Zoma as well as Ben Azai, what was their name? Their name was Shimon. We're talking about the day of Rav Shimon ben Yochai. But let us go a step further, the Rebbe says. In this Perek, we also have a quotation of Rav Shimon. And that is the second part of Mishnah Yud Gimel. The second part of Mishnah Yud Gimel, Rab Shimon says, Shloisha Ksarim Heim, there are three crowns. Kesa Torah, Kesa Kahuna, the Kesa Malchus. The crown of Torah, the crown of Kahuna, and the crown of kingship. And then he concludes, V'Keser Shem Tov Oila Al Gabeya. And the crown of a good name surpasses them all. The Rebbe is asking, this is a quotation of whom? A quotation of Rab Shimon. It's a famous Gemara. The Gemara tells us that Rab Shimon was Toirosoi Nosoi. His occupation was Torah. The Gemara tells us that there was a difference in opinion between Rab Shimon and Rabbi Shmuel. Rab Shimon ben Yochai claimed, Toirosoi Nosoi. Every person has to make sure that his occupation should be Torah. Otherwise, what's going to be with Torah? We're going to desert Torah, we'll neglect Torah. The other Tanoim claimed, no, a person should set himself up to have a shir in Torah, have a shir in Torah in the morning, have a shir in Torah in the evening, and during the day he's busy with his occupation, otherwise how will we earn a living? So the Gemara continues, Harbe osu kerashbi v'lo yalsa biyadam. There were many that followed the path of Rashbi and were not successful. Because actually it's impossible for an average person that he should be only involved in Torah and not in anything else. There were many that followed the suggestion of the other Tanoim and they were successful. They had a shir of Torah in the morning, a shir of Torah in the evening, and during the day they earned a living. But Rab Shimon is known to stress the greatness of Torah. So Rab Shimon is telling us here that there are three crowns. However, what does he say? You should know that the crown of a good name surpasses them all. He should have stressed the crown of Torah surpasses everything, because this was his belief. His ideology is that a person has to be Torasayim Nasai. So therefore, how does it come for Rab Shimon to say that there are three crowns, and includes the crown of Torah as one of them, but however he tells us that the Keser of Shem Tov is Eilal Gabe. The Rebbe asked another question which he spoke about previously. The Mishnah starts off that there are three crowns. How does the Mishnah conclude with a fourth one? So here the Rebbe learns, Keser Shem Tov Oila Al Gabein. The crown of a good name surpasses them all. Why does the Mishnah use the expression of Keser Shem Tov Oila Al Gabeihen? Goes on top of all of them. Mishnah could have used the expression V'Keser Shem Tov is better than them, is stronger than them. So what does the Mishnah mean? Mishnah means, when is the crown of a good name so effective that it surpasses them all? When it's Al Gabeihen, when it comes together with all of them, not individually. When a person is in a position that he possesses the crown of Torah, the crown of Kahuna, and the crown of Malchus, and the crown of a good name is Oila Al Gabei and goes on top of them. In other words, they are there, but the crown of a good name goes on top of it. That is when the Keser Shem Tov is so meaningful. And today the Rebbe went a step further, and he's teaching what is the union of a Keser Shem Tov, a shame and a Tov. The Rebbe is learning that the Keser Shem Tov basically means the union of mitzvahs. And through what is the whole idea of mitzvahs? Chassidus teaches that mitzvahs stems from the word tzafsa v'chibo, an attachment. When a yid fulfills a mitzvah, it becomes attached to the Rebbe. So the Rebbe is learning as follows. Rab Shimon ben Yochai, Rashbi, Rab Shimon, was in a level of Torasayim Nosai. Torah was his occupation. True. In other words, he lived up to a standard of constantly learning Torah. This is what he did, and this is what he demanded from others. However, this is only how Torah was in a level of an occupation. In other words, there is room for something higher than that. A person has his occupation, but there's room for a higher union than his occupation. So Rab Shimon tells us that there's shloisha ksarim hein. And we know Taka Rab Shimon stresses the greatness of Torah. However, at the same time, Rab Shimon tells us you should know Keser Shem Tov, because in Keser Shem Tov lies the expression how a Yid is tying himself together with the Rebishter. A Keser Shem Tov, this is Oila Al Gabeim, this surpasses everything. Because the main union, why does the neshama come down into this world? This is so that the Yid should be able to attach himself to the Rebishter. Where do we find
in the strongest way an attachment between a Yid and the Eibishter, this is found in Keser Shem Tov, this meaning in the Inyan of mitzvahs. The Inyan of mitzvahs, this is where Yid becomes solely attached with the Eibishter. It was in today's Farbrengen also that the Rebbe spoke about the Russian Jews and explained at length the great tzaras, the great problems which they have suffered in Russia throughout all the years. And the Rebbe expressed himself that it is more than a yovel. Yovel means 50 years. It is more than a yovel that the existing situation is going on in Russia. And in Chazal and in Psukim we find the expression of yovel meaning li olam. If we want to use the word olam, which means which is an expression of eternity, 50 years is already considered an expression of li olam. Seishen, forever. Which, when we calculate that for 50 years, and it's more than 50 years, that there's such an existing situation going on in Russia, and all the mitzvahs and good deeds and all the inyanim for Yiddishkeit, which Yidden in Russia do, they are literally sacrificing their lives so that they should be able to do it. So when these Yidden come out of Russia, obviously the Rebbe spoke this in continuation to what the Rebbe has spoken previously in Farbrengen, is about putting up a special yishuv, a special community in Yerushalayim for the Russian immigrants, for the individuals that are coming out of Russia. The Rebbe says, when these Yidden come out of Russia now, whatever good we do with them, we have still not done with them what they deserve. In other words, we're talking about individuals that have gone through such mesiras nefesh. Whatever expression of warmth and good and friendship which we are extending to them, they still deserve more. The Rebbe concluded the Farbrengen with a strong bracha, that being that we are about to enter Lag B'Omer, so all of the inyanim of Lag B'Omer, all the various parades and gatherings which will be taking place here as well as elsewhere should be blessed with a lot of atzlacha, especially that all of this has a shaykhs to Reb Shimon ben Yochai. Now regarding Reb Shimon ben Yochai, there are two expressions in Chazal. There's one expression in Chazal where the Gemara says Kedai Reb Shimon lismoich alav b'shas hatchak, which in simple interpretation means that when there's a machlokes between Reb Shimon and another sage, even though the halacha is not like Reb Shimon, still if one will rely on Reb Shimon b'shas hatchak in an exceptional situation, it is also accepted. That is one Chazal. Then there's another Chazal where Reb Shimon expressed himself, Yechilna lifter es ha'olam min hadin, that he is capable of saving the world from judgment. So in Chassidus, both of these expressions are combined. And the interpretation of Kedai Reb Shimon lisma cholov b'shas hatchak is explained that Reb Shimon is worthwhile, that we should rely on him at a time of tchak. What means at a time of tchak? And a time when we are in a time of hardships, when we are in a time of gullus. When we are in a time of gullus, we will rely on Reb Shimon. And as the Rebbe stressed today, not only rely, but lismoich. Lismoich stemming from the word, we will lean on him. We will put pressure on him. What will we put pressure on Reb Shimon? That he should fulfill what he said. The other expression, Yechilna lifter es ha'olam min hadin, that he can save the world from judgment. Memela, now is the proper time that Reb Shimon should fulfill what he said, and therefore help taking us out of Golis, and that Golis should no longer be Golis, and take us all with Mashiach to Eretz Yisrael. In the Farbrengen, the Rebbe mentioned a very interesting, I can't recall at the moment what he tied it into, but he mentioned a very interesting episode, that there was a chassid called Reb Nechemye de Brovner. So Reb Nechemye de Brovner was a chassid in the days of the Alter Rebbe, of the Mitteler Rebbe, And he was a merchant. And he was once busy preparing a statement on his business. Naturally, this is something which Alpi Halacha and Alpi Torah, one is supposed to do, and prepare an honest statement on his business, which he did. And when it came to one of the sheets of paper, where he had to put down a total, instead of putting the number in rubles, whatever situation was in his particular case, instead of putting the total, what did he put down as a total? Ein oid milvadoi. There's nobody but the Eibishter. The Rebbe explained this was not that he did something just like to make a joke or to sound funny or something like it. It means he was in the middle of his preparing his business figures, calculating his business, his numbers, his arithmetic on his business. However, he took himself for this one moment, he got distracted from his business cheshbonus and came to the realization that there is nothing but the Eibishter. And later, in fact, the Rebbe says that later when he was asked, how come this happened? I mean, you're not in the middle of davening or learning now that you're coming to a total of Ein Oid Milvada, you're in the middle of preparing your business figures. So he responded. He gave an answer. He says, Madach, that when we are in the middle of davening and learning, we have thoughts for our business, and this happens to all of us. So when I'm in the middle of making business figures, am I not permitted to think a moment about the Eibishter? And this is what happened. So when I had to, instead of writing the total, I wrote instead, Ein Oid Milvadei, there's nobody other than the Eibishter. A gute Woche.